Right. Moving
Yeah.
on to rugby.
Yep.
The whole World
Yeah.
Rugby bans
Okay.
trans women.
You keep. I'm like, I'm going to build up to the story and then you
I'm
spoil
sorry,
it.
go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. On the 9th of October, World Rugby became the first international governing body to ban trans women from women's sports, unfortunately. While trans women are allowed to play touch, which is a non-contact variant of rugby, which was also considered a sport in its own right, they're allowed to play touch alongside cis women. And national governing bodies are allowed flexibility for grassroots competitions in whether or not they'll allow trans women. But trans women cannot play contact rugby alongside cis women in elite and international competitions anymore. Trans men are allowed to still play contact rugby, but we have to confirm we understand that we're at greater risk. And then they weren't really clear on what the plan is for non-binary people. Their abandonment of their former policy was the same as the one set by the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, which is hormone testosterone levels under 10 nanomoles a liter for at least a year, and I think that's it now. They abandoned the whole gonadectomy thing, didn't they?
I do not know.
You did this for a whole year.
Yeah, I did this for a whole year, and then I got an extortionate amount of abuse, and I stopped functioning for a year. So,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's just like, yeah.
So they abandoned their former IOC policy partially on the advice of the anti-trans hate group Fair Play for Women. They allowed Fair Play for Women to advise them on this, but they did not get any kind of advisement from actual trans people, trans advocates, scientists who know what they're talking about. But at least on the bright side, World Rugby has earned itself a great deal of criticism from this.
Mm-hmm.
84 academics from across the world signed a letter to the members of the World Rugby Executive Committee where they criticized the ruling for a number of things, including it being based on data that's unpublished, that has not been peer-reviewed, and in one study's case, fails to include trans athletes altogether. Anyone who was watching the controversy last year, you remember how Woodford did the whole thing where he compared cis men to cis women,
Mm-hmm.
and pretended that was the same as comparing trans women to cis women? World Rugby did that.
Yeah.
That's
the current standard with things.
Yeah, it wasn't just one ranting silly person on YouTube. It was an actual international organization did the same thing. Mm-hmm. And the letter also says, quote, "As you are likely aware from World Rugby's pioneering research on concussions, conducting research to determine injury rates/risks is resource-intensive, difficult, and the findings are often inconclusive," unquote. So in other words, World Rugby's own research on cis women, and maybe cis men probably, shows that they couldn't possibly know either way. It's not a thing that you can really research, especially not with unpublished, unpeer-reviewed data that doesn't even include trans people half the time. It's just a mess. And that's not the end of the criticism either. Another letter to World Rugby was written. There's a whole website for it. It was signed by rugby organizations, referees, and hundreds of elite athletes from 12 different countries, where they detail even more issues. I have a whole list again. They criticized the total absence of reported safety incidents involving elite trans women. This is literally not a problem. They banned trans women based on a problem that doesn't exist, not even one isolated incident. It isn't a problem, and they banned trans women anyway. There's no scientific or anecdotal evidence that trans women are dominating the sport.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even have anecdotes backing this up.
Yeah. Every time someone brings up a certain case, you almost always look into it and you find cis athletes outperforming them in the majority of cases, or they're part of a group sport, in which case it's incredibly like difficult to like focus on one person.
And of course, rugby is a group sport.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the idea that they're dominating the sport is very difficult to prove. They also criticized, they criticized World Rugby for betraying their alleged values, but we expect that anyway. They criticized the sexism in viewing women as inherently small, weak, and in need of special protections in sport. And one thing that's very important to highlight as well is, there's a harm to cis women as well in that certain cis women can be targeted just for their appearance. World Rugby actually did a survey where they asked elite players, are you aware of or do you suspect that you have ever played with or against a trans woman? So now we're judging women based on their appearance, trying to figure out if they're trans or not. And that, of course, is very harmful to a lot of cis women whose bodies don't conform to sexist ideas of what a woman is. And what's particularly important to highlight is that this will disproportionately harm players of color. The original letter says black and brown, but also this affects and indigenous, but also this affects Asian women as well, where our idea of what a woman really looks like or should look like is based on white women, and black, brown, indigenous, and Asian women often look different to that idea. And so you may have seen a while ago there was an image going around of some Asian women who are Olympic athletes, and a bunch of people saying that they were actually men because they happen to have narrower hips than we generally think of when we think of white women. They also criticized World Rugby because there are no height or weight limits in rugby. So there's all this fear-mongering about trans women a problem because they're taller and bigger, but that's not something you can ban someone from rugby based on. It's not in the rules. They criticized the lack of study on trans athletes again. They also criticized World Rugby for breaking multiple anti-discrimination rules at the local, state/provincial, territorial, national, and international levels. World Rugby is literally a criminal, just places all over the world.
And it all comes back to like the very first point I made in my video response to Woodford was pointing out like the human rights which are violated by this kind of action. Like people are, sports is just sports. It's not linked to like a bigger picture. These are the rights which are violated when you block someone who has a right to compete from doing so, which includes trans women, intersex women, all women. The right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to sexual and reproductive health, the right to work and to the enjoyment of just and favourable conditions of work, the right to privacy, the right to freedom from torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment and harmful practices, and full respect for the dignity, bodily integrity, and bodily autonomy of the person. This isn't just a sports thing. This is a human rights issue.
That was actually the next one.
Sorry.
No, that was a good point, and you expanded on it way more than I could. But yeah, the next point is World Rugby was criticized for violating the human right to participate in sport free of discrimination as detailed by the Olympic Charter. And then the last one I've got here, which is actually the first criticism they made, is they're criticized for being at odds with IOC guidelines, which is actually kind of a big deal when you think about it. World Rugby thinks that they know better than the Olympics. The Olympics basically the only organization that could talk down to World Rugby, and they say World Rugby has it wrong. So is there anything you'd like to add before I summarize?
There's so much here. Like, one of the things we should get like clear is like what standard can you actually argue to exclude trans people? Because like a lot of people run around like talking about unfair advantage, and it's a question of how do you show an unfair advantage. And like in what happened in 2019, I came to like a very easy, quick rule. It's not like an end-all solution, but it's an easy rule to see if there is absolutely no basis behind the point someone is arguing. And it pretty simply says if this standard or argument that a person is resorting to argue that trans women should be banned from sport applied to cis women equally and would result in certain cis women being excluded from sport, that is a bullshit standard. So, for example, when it comes to height, I think the example I always go to is Margot Didek.
Margot Didek, 7'2", I believe.
Yes, was 7'2", a 7'2" basketball player. So if you're arguing that trans people, like trans women on average being slightly higher than cis women, should result in them being excluded, trans women 5'8" to 6'2", average, then you have to explain why people like Margot Didek, who was 7'2", weren't excluded.
What actually makes me laugh is they're always saying, "Oh, these 6-foot trans women, these 6-foot trans women." But Ethel, isn't your mum about 6 feet?
Yeah, she is. She is. She is like just a couple inches smaller than me. She is taller than my father. I grew past my father when I was 14. From behind because I have the same hairstyle to my mum when I get it cut shorter. The neighbours, like when I'm locking up, the neighbours like rush out to tell us something, and they often mistake me for her from the back because we're both the same height roughly. So it's like you can't exclude trans women and then let cis women play with these traits. And before, I know someone's going to fucking say it if they see it. They're going to say, oh, well, Margot Didek was quite clearly a secret trans. Margot Didek died giving childbirth. That sounds horrible that I have to point that out, but I've had people in the past, like, theorize that actually they were a secret trans. And that it always comes down to, like, hand size and everything, which just shows, again, how all of this just hurts everybody.
It's just intense misogyny. It shows a complete lack of understanding of how diverse women can be.
We can't ignore the fact that the treatment of Caster Semenya has nothing to do with her being a black lesbian. Her being a black lesbian, being perceived as more masculine for both things, played a big part in the shit she's received. That's where the list of rights I got. If you don't know, Caster Semenya is an intersex cis woman. So she was assigned female at birth. She's always grown up being female. And it turns out that she has slightly higher testosterone. But like people started calling her out because she was doing well and because she was a black lesbian. Oh, she has to be a man, And it became this horrifically racist, misogynistic shit show. And here's the thing, like, people will always bring up the differences in performance between cis men and cis women in sport. And they always say that this is the result of, this is biologically inherent in gender. They have no basis for that. Yes, there are differences in the performance rates between these two groups, but only one of those groups comes from a demographic which, at a young age, is typically told not to engage with sports, to instead engage with social games, is underfunded critically, is seen as not a legitimate pursuit. There's a reason we have sports and women's sports. There's all these variables involved which we could be focusing on. We could go to tackle the underfunding of female sports versus male sports. We could tackle the sexist nature in which children are raised. Because, by the way, sports is not the only way that's impacted. Psychology has shown that cis women on average are better at social skills psychologically, and cis men on average are better at like spatial awareness. And like sexists love to come along, grab that, and run with it and say, you see, this is biological determinism. Women are the carers, men are the hunters. And it's like, or it's the facts that infants are treated very differently or based on their perceived gender. Again, boys are told, go outside, climb a tree, throw a ball, play some games. All of this, which trains spatial awareness. Girls are taught
Actually,
social skills.
I saw this really interesting documentary where they tried to they got a classroom of like primary school kids and tried to basically teach them and treat them gender neutrally, and also get them to do things that are associated with the opposite gender, and try and undo that programming. And one of the things they did was they got them to play tangrams a whole bunch. And at first, the girls were really bad at them. The boys were really good. But within like a couple of months, the girls caught up, and some of the best kids in the class were girls. It is all just teaching. I wish I could remember the name of that documentary, because it is actually very, very insightful. I think it was something like, can we raise our kids gender free? I don't know. I'll have to see. Might add a link later.
But like we've conducted experiments in psychology where we take an infant and there's 3 samples. There's 5. There's one where you take a cis girl infant and you tell people it's a girl. You take a cis girl infant and tell them it's a boy. And like you do the same with the boys as well. And like even though people think they're like gender neutral, the way they talk to and describe the actions of the infant changes based on the perceived gender. If they're not told the child's gender, they have no fucking clue how to react. But yeah, and like, you know, so if like someone reaches into the crib and the child grabs the hand, you know, if they're told it's a boy, it doesn't matter what the gender of the child actually is. If they're told it's a boy, it's like, oh, such a strong little boy. If they're told it's a girl, oh, she's so beautiful and she just wants to hold other people, you know. There's a lot that needs to be accounted before we can go, this is simply the result of biological determinism. Like, there are differences, but how much those differences account for anything is up for question. And again, with the range of human experience, we are all a blend of sexual characteristics. The perfectly sexually dimorphic person does not exist. You know, and when I state that if the standard to exclude trans women could in theory exclude cis women as well, I need to be absolutely clear. That includes intersex cis women. Because just as the United Nations Human Rights Council has made very clear, intersex cis women are cis women and have the right to play as women as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, so if you want to know all the information on this ruling and why it's wrong and why no one agrees with it, who matters, rugbyforall.co. That's very important. .co, not .com. .com is a different thing. If you happen to know any people in your life who like might be receptive to the information, you know, don't go talking to people who are just going to make you miserable. But anyone who might be receptive to the information, who might just not know, you can pass that along to them if you want. But yeah, basically, with this World Rugby thing, we got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that trans women can't play rugby internationally. It's just not allowed, which is really tragic. The good news is that no one supports World Rugby's decision in this. Even actively looking for it, I could only find support from Fair Play for Women, Piers Morgan, and Gavin Mortimer, and everyone else is either lukewarm or firmly supportive of trans rights. The bad news is that World Rugby is doing the ban anyway. They did not even have a formal process for this ruling. They just did it. But the good news is I have seen some whispers of like, especially in Australia, of organizations looking at trans inclusive policies. So, in addition, with a bunch of national organizations being firmly on the side of trans rights, it's possible that this could spur things to improve on the national level and improve in grassroots organizations. And maybe international organizations could take a firmer stance, and other sports might not have this problem. It looks like this is going to motivate other people to improve. So, if you're a trans woman and you're interested in professional rugby and you're really good at it, then I'm very, very sorry. I am very sorry. However, hopefully, for the majority of trans women, probably won't be going to international competitions anyway. Hopefully, things will improve for you. It's not a great situation, but we've got to look for the positives where we can find them.
Just a reminder, this show and this channel are run purely on donations. It's how we keep things going. It's the only source of income, and it's just how we keep things going. You can donate via Patreon monthly, or you can use the Super Chat, or there is a link posted by the Streamlabs bot every now and then. You can donate via that as well. If you use the Super Chat, Google does take, I think, about 30%. All of it goes straight back into operating the channel. All my funds, or all the funds for the channel, are public, so you can see them on Patreon. Nothing is hidden, etc. You know exactly how much we make. So also, if you want to have a conversation with us and you'd like to call in, do know you can message me via Twitter. My Twitter handle is Essence of Tweet. Just message me the topic, your name, whatever you want to go by. So it can be a username, so a pseudonym, or it can be a real name, whatever, as well as your pronouns. And we'll try to set that up after our final story. So far, I have no calls. If we have no calls, no one wants to call in by the end of the show, we'll just have to end it once we've gone over our topics. But if you'd like to call in, then feel free. It'll be interesting to hear some of your thoughts on what we've already discussed here. So you can talk about anything you discussed on the show, or you can talk about anything else. Of course, we can only really talk about what we know. So it might end up being you telling us about stuff that has happened in a certain case. But yes, we'd definitely be interested to hear your thoughts. So yes, I think that is the general thing. So if you want to continue with the last story.
Yep.